Active Directory is organised hierarchically. It's partitioned into the following logical components. Sites. These are representative of the physical localities in your organisation. You will typically set up a site for each physical location. Sites consist of subnets which map to network structure. This enables computers, through their IP configurations, to determine where they are in the world through their site membership. Forests. Typically, an organisation will implement a single Active Directory forest. A forest is a collection of domains structured in trees. A domain is a logical administrative unit within an Active Directory forest. Your forest may consist of a single Active Directory domain, referred to as the root domain, or it may consist of several domains built into a structure known as a tree. A tree has a common root and a contiguous namespace, by which I mean a tree will consist of domains which have a parent-child relationship. So, for example, the sales.pearson.com domain is part of the pearson.com domain. The contiguous namespace is the pearson.com element. Pearson.com is the root, sales.pearson.com is a subdomain in a tree. For organisational purposes, you may structure your computers and users into organisational units. This allows you to allocate configuration settings to those users and computers based on membership of an organisational unit. It also allows you to delegate administration on organisational units. These then are the logical components of Active Directory. But Active Directory also consists of physical components. Domain controllers contain the configuration that we outlined just a moment ago. They are physical servers that contain partitions of information that define the logical components of your Active Directory infrastructure. Some of these domain controllers are configured as global catalog servers. These maintain a special database which contains information at the forest level. Active Directory is a multi-master database, which means that you can make changes to Active Directory on any instance of the data. For the most part, that's true. There are certain operations that you can only perform on a single instance of the data. These sorts of operations are held by operations masters. It's not really necessary for you to worry too much about what those are, but there are 5 of those. 2 of those are forest-wide, and 3 of them are on a per-domain basis. So these are designated domain controllers that hold a specific role for when you need to, for example, add a new domain or change the schema of your Active Directory. For branch offices, you may decide to deploy read-only domain controllers. This provides for additional security at locations that may lack physical security that you have in the headquarters offices. To deploy Active Directory, you must configure a server running Windows Server 2016 to become a domain controller. To do this, install the ADDS server role. Then run the Promote this server to a domain controller wizard. Active Directory can be managed using a number of different tools. Common tools include the Active Directory Administrative Center, the Active Directory module for Windows PowerShell, enabling you to perform management from the command line, the Group Policy Management Console, Active Directory Users and Computers, which enables you to, as the name suggests, manage users, computers, and also groups, the Active Directory Sites and Services tool, which enables you to manage the sites and subnets and the links between them for your Active Directory infrastructure, and the Domains and Trusts tool. This is used if you have multiple forests or multiple domains and you want to manually configure trusts between them. Trust is a way of allowing users in one location or one domain to access resources in another. For the exam, you probably need to be familiar with the Active Directory Administrative Center. You can perform the following tasks using this tool: create users and groups, create organisational units to structure your users and groups, create computer accounts, create INET.org person objects, change the forest or domain functional level. Different functional levels introduce different features. This is only really relevant if you have multiple different versions of Windows Server running, perhaps Windows Server 2008, Windows Server 2012, Windows Server 2016. And then the abilities or the functions that you have at a given forest or domain functional level can be adjusted by raising the forest or domain functional level. So you can do that using the ADAC tool. You can enable the Active Directory recycle bin. That's very useful if you delete a user or a computer object. You can recover it, and you can configure the recovery by enabling the Active Directory recycle bin and configuring its properties. Generally speaking, password policies are configured at the domain level and therefore apply to all users within a given domain. A password policy handles things like password expiration, password complexity, password lockouts. You can configure fine-grained password policies using the ADAC tool, which enable you to configure password policies on other than a domain-wide basis, so for specific users or groups of users. Dynamic access control is the ability to control access to file resources based on criteria such as membership of a group or working at a particular office or other characteristics of a user. So it's a claims-based system. Let's take a look at managing Active Directory using the ADAC tool. So before we do anything else in terms of managing Active Directory, we need to install the Active Directory management tools. The way to do that on Windows 10 is to download the Remote Server Administration toolset. Navigate to the Microsoft.com website and, or otherwise search for Remote Server Admin Tools for Windows 10 and then click the download link. I'm going to download the version that I need, which is the 64-bit version of RSAT for Windows Server 2016 x64. So in fact, actually I already have this file, so there's no need for me to download it. Here we can see it's in the Downloads folder. So all I need to do is to double click the file and follow the installation instructions. I'm just going to run this. I'm connected to my domain at the moment, so it can't see the internet within my virtual machine environment, so I'll ignore this message, but everything's fine with this file, so I'm going to run. I'm going to accept the license agreement, and then the Remote Server Administration tools will be installed. I mean, the alternative to this is to connect to a server using remote desktop and use the remote management tools that way, or server administration tools that way, or indeed to visit the server directly. But generally speaking, it's safer to perform administration from a client machine rather than at the server. Okay, so installation is complete, and the remote server administration tools are now available. So if we click on Start, scroll down, we can see the Windows Administrative Tools. These are the local tools, but they have also had added to them the Active Directory Administrative Center, the Active Directory Domains and Trusts, Module for Windows PowerShell, Sites and Services, Users and Computers Tools, and a number of others, ADC-Edit, Certification Authority, and so on and so on. Let's take a quick look at some of the more useful tools. I'm going to start with Active Directory Users and Computers. You get a view here on the domain. This is pearson.com, and the containers beneath it, including the built-in container for users and groups. There's an organizational unit here called sales, and we use organizational units to, I suppose, organize our environment based along geographic, or in this case, departmental lines. An organizational unit will typically contain users, groups, and computers to which you will assign management permissions and on which you will configure properties. It's very easy to use this tool to create users. Right click, choose new, and then select user, or likewise group or computer. In addition to that tool, we also have the Active Directory Sites and Services tool, and this essentially allows you to manage replication of Active Directory information around your physical sites. So at the moment there's only a default first site because it's a new Active Directory deployment, but we can create multiple sites that represent the physical localities within our network, and then we can configure the behavior of Active Directory replication between those sites. It's probably a bit of an advanced tool for us to worry about right now. Scrolling back down here, I've also got the Active Directory Domains and Trusts tool, which is useful in a multiple domain environment where you can establish trusts between your various domains and or forests if you have multiple Active Directory forests. Again, probably outside the scope of this course and the exam. So let's instead take a look at the Active Directory Administrative Center. Let's maximize that. And in a similar way to Active Directory users and computers, it presents you with a view of the local domain and its subcontainers, which you may remember from the previous tool. There's the sales organizational unit, for example. Expand that and then select something like sales. And then you can create objects within the sales OU. So you can say new user and then specify some details. A UPN logon name. I'll go with surname and initials. Specify password. Protect that from accidental deletion because it's an important user. User must change password next logon, or I could say other password options and say password never expires and that the user cannot change password. We'll talk a bit more about when those might be useful perhaps later. When I'm happy with that, I can click OK. But notice there are other tabs over here. I can specify that this particular user is a member of a group. So I've added that user to the domain admins group. I can configure profile settings. So for example, a home folder, a network drive which will be mapped to that home folder each time the user signs in. I can specify a logon script to run when the user signs in, and I can specify a profile path to store the user's desktop and application settings in. That's what we call a roaming profile, and again we'll discuss that a bit later in the course. So for now I'm just going to click OK, and that will create my user. Creating things like groups or computers is not really any different. You have different properties to define, but the process is pretty similar. We'll revisit the Administrative Center later in the course. In the demonstration, you saw how to install the remote server administration tools and how to use ADAC to manage a user object.